So, I'm sure you've noticed, there's a lot of adult games on Steam, huh? Now, maybe it's because I'm the producer of a video game where one of the endings is a monster orgy, but I don't know. I feel like this is an every person thing. That or I'm just some sort of pervert, which, over the last couple of years, especially post-pandemic, there seems to be a noticeable increase in the amount of adult-oriented games showing up on Steam. In the under $10 category, mixed in with titles like Sonic Adventure 2, KOTOR, and Vampire Survivors, you'll find games like Wedding Witch, a game very similar to the previously mentioned Vampire Survivors, except with not safe for work gameplay. Or Love and War Hero by Chance 2. I cannot believe there's a 2. A tactical RPG where your victories are rewarded with naughty PNGs. There's dating sims, match 3 games, card games, everything you can think of, all with pretty positive reviews. In fact, one of the funniest things I read was some guy's negative review about how the erotic scenes in Love and War were a little too BDSM for him. And mind you, this is just a taste of the wide variety of adult titles that came out in the last year. Some games have become so mainstream that they even have celebrities like Doja Cat. Of course, I'm talking about House Party, a game that is nearly 10 years old now, where your main objective is to get laid at a party. So what happened? How did we get here? What was the impetus, not only for this new wave of adult games, but also the ease in which they were accepted not only by Steam, but by the gaming world at large? When I say adult games, I'm sure some of you are like, what exactly do you mean by that, Jesse? Well, according to the ESRB, adult-only games are games that feature content suitable only for adults ages 18 and up. These may include prolonged scenes of intense violence, graphic sexual content, and or gambling with real currency. Which, now that I think about it, I wonder if there's a market for a strip poker gambling game with guns. But I think it's safe to say that because I'm American and our messed up value system makes us completely immune to the more effed up displays of violence in games that have been happening for decades, that when I say adult, I'm talking about the more porny side of adult gaming that seems to have suddenly exploded in the last few short years. Now, I'm aware that erotic games have been around since the beginning, and it's nothing new, it's human nature. In the early 80s, as game sales began to explode, games like Beat 'em and Eat 'em, Soft Porn Adventure, and X-Man were playable on the Atari, Apple II, and DOS. But then, as many other video game documentaries and videos on this site have explained, from 1983 to 1985, the video game market crashed in the US due to market saturation and for what many believe were just too many games that were simply bad. This is because prior to 1979, there were no real third-party video game devs. It wasn't until Activision came along, founded by 4 former Atari devs, that they began developing their own games and cartridges. Atari sued, but Activision won, and this set a precedent for third-party games manufacturers, especially with the critical success of Activision's Pitfall. Due to the success of third-party games, the total number of Atari games grew from 100 to 400 between June 1982 and December 1982. It was during this time that we got some of the earliest dirty games. And it makes sense because since the dawn of time, man has always found a way to make their nights less lonely. Why would video games be any different? Even if it's pixelated to hell and your eyes go cross-eyed, you know when you're not supposed to see something when you see it. Unfortunately, for those dirty folks in the early 80s, the majority of these new games were bad. Like, really bad. In 1982, Byte Magazine wrote about the state of gaming at the time, saying, "Few games broke new ground in either design or format. If the public really likes an idea, it is milked for all it's worth, and numerous clones of a different color soon crowd the shelves." Which, thankfully for us, is something that stopped in the 80s. It isn't like one of those history repeats itself things, right? Right? So the games industry was flooded with trash, which led to a crash. And it took 2 years to recover, and when 1985 hit, the space had changed. At this time, the market for adult games shifted from the Atari to personal computers, which significantly impacted the market and audience size since PCs were only in 8% of households by 1985. Games during this time were things like the text-based Dr. Ruth's Computer Game of Good Sex and Centerfold Squares, which is barely a game from what I can tell. But then, in 1987, Sierra released Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, a point-and-click game where the objective was to help the titular Larry get laid. And if you're going, Larry from Like the confused GIF? Then I don't blame you. The series hasn't been popular for years, but in the 80s and 90s, this seemed like the only franchise pushing the limits of what adult games were capable of. This is a true story, and to my mom, who probably watched this video wondering, I wonder what Jesse's gonna talk about. I remember how excited and nervous I was the first time I booted up Leisure Suit Larry Love for Sale on my family computer. My parents were out of town. I was like, I'm gonna try this game. It felt like Mission Impossible. I had no idea when they were gonna come home. I was just like, how far can I get? The funny thing is, the first game released to no fanfare. It only sold an abysmal 4,000 copies when it was released. And its creator, Al Lowe, said, my initial reaction was that I had wasted 6 months of my life. But what Al didn't know was that word of mouth began to spread about Larry and his horny escapades, and by the end of the year, it had sold over 250,000 copies, which is huge for this time period, and honestly, big today for games. However, with big sales comes big controversy. Anger over a game with sex. And you might be surprised to know this, but the Leisure Suit Larry games are not as racy as you would think, unless you use codes, but it's mostly innuendo and implication. Something that's true for almost all the games from this point forward. Innuendo, maybe a boob or two, but nothing gratuitous. It was, after all, a point-and-click puzzle-solving game with rewarding challenges first, and then those rewards happened to be Larry getting laid. For every Leisure Suit Larry we got pushing the boundaries of what games could be, we still got a helping of games like Blue Angel 69 and Strip Poker. As we move into the CD-ROM era, games like Plumbers Don't Wear Ties or Neurodancer used sexuality to sell copies. Unfortunately, it was never a lot of copies, nor did it deliver in any other capacity. Any games from this era that did deliver were just glorified porn cut into segments, and you'd have to click around to try and find the next scene. They barely were games and barely worth the money. And this continued for some time unless you were living outside the West, because in Japan, they were going crazy with their dirty games, most of which were on PC. There's no way you're gonna get those titles on Nintendo. So when Night Trap, a game that used sexuality and violence to sell itself to Nintendo's rival Sega, came out, people lost their minds. We're talking congressional hearings, and you bet Nintendo and Sega were coming at each other's throats. For much of the late 90s and early 2000s, adult games were relegated to PC or imported from other countries. This included extremely violent games like Doom or Mortal Kombat, those being about exploding bodies, so I guess that was okay, and eventually they got ported to consoles. But the saucier games, they stayed on PC. If you pull up Wikipedia and check a list of adults-only rated games, you'll notice that it's almost all Windows. But, you know, how adult were these adult-only games really? Games like BMX XXX and the Guy game marketed their games as spicier than they really were, using the classic high-level marketing method of plastering a hot woman all over the game. To give you some idea of what people thought about games like that at the time, when Playboy The Mansion came out, the game where you run the Playboy Mansion, the New York Times wrote, sex and nudity often work well in movies, but video games laced with sex never rise above mediocrity, and Mansion seems decidedly underbaked. The Detroit Free Press said, I flipped on the game expecting a world of champagne, roses, and frequent wisps of steam. Instead, I got an immediate request that I construct an office on the mansion's upper floor. So you can probably see now that this era of adult games has been reined in. Gone is the era of freaky little Atari games for freaky little Atari horn dogs. However, as the internet grew in popularity in the mid-2000s, a new format, Java, entered the fray. And with this came a deluge of short games and websites hosting them, as more and more of these games were created by people like IT students and hobbyists. Knowledge of these little online games spread on websites like eBaum's World and Newgrounds. If you're old enough to have used those, you know that besides wacky humor and strange animations, there was so much dirty content. In this time period, before the rise of YouTube, having viewers actually became profitable, with some of those dirtier artists gaining notoriety and monetization through promoting their personal websites, services, etc. Thus, the zeitgeist among the community became, maybe I could do this too. Meanwhile, in the mainstream market of games, any game that featured a little bit of nudity was still seen as unnecessary or just a means to sell copies. I don't know how many of you remember this, but people thought the Mass Effect games were going to be extra saucy and spicy, and the only things they were exposed to were meaningful relationship dynamics and lovemaking scenes that faded to black and had no nudity. And then, in 2011, The Witcher 2 was released. It was amazing. The combat, the story, the absolute adult nature of the game, not the porny stuff. I'm talking about a game that was clearly made for adults, with adult subjects. But it was also dirty as hell. As far as I can recall, it was the first time I saw a modern major release with, dare I say it, nipples? Sure, it wasn't really a major floodgate moment. CD Projekt Red wasn't as big as it is now, but in 2012, when Mass Effect 3 came out, suddenly Liara's showing a bit more skin. Witcher 2 seemed like an aberration in the gaming space because adult games still existed in this kind of weird, this is for the creeps part of the internet. Then that all changed. CD Projekt returned with one of the best games ever made, The Witcher 3, which had many of the same adult themes as the previous entry, but cranked up to 11. This was a game that not only impressed with gameplay, but also the story, the music, the graphics. In my eyes, this was the first time a majority of gamers ever experienced a full love story without fading to black or weird camera angle crops. Two characters who were real, just, in a fantasy environment. It was honest with what it was, and that blew people away. As of today, it's sold over 50 million copies. I still think about that Conan O'Brien Clueless Gamer where he's like, "This is the greatest game ever made." It got Conan, y'all, and he is not into games. This single game crushed the concept that you couldn't sell a game or get a positive critical response if it had adult content. Because turns out all you had to do was make a good game. Crazy! Let me tell you, 50 million copies sold is a lot of money. And when people see money, they get crazy ideas, especially in the games industry, like, let's make a game that's exactly like this too. And so big companies took inspiration from the success of Witcher 3. The idea that you couldn't do adult things like talk about sex or have sex or show sex while also cutting off limbs and blowing up guys was a thing of the past. And it just so happens that around this time, that Steam started to allow indie devs to publish whatever games they wanted after they shut down their Greenlight service. Suddenly, the taboo of nudity began to vanish in the gaming world, especially since in Japan they were still pumping out porn games like crazy and now had a new market to sell to. By 2018, it was noticeable that more and more dirty games were showing up on Steam, and suddenly, outrage showed its head once more. This time in the form of anti-porn lobbyists who actively campaigned against games being on Steam. This led to the company reacting by sending takedown notices to many devs. Games like Honey Pop and Mutiny, your run-of-the-mill anime boob games that were very popular, were of course the main target. The uproar that followed this decision, though, was unexpected. The amount of people who wanted to keep adult games on the platform. Steam's reaction was to back off completely with a statement that basically said, "Sorry, we're just trying to prevent troll games. We didn't mean to try and remove these real games with real fans. Our bad." And with this Gaben-blessed hands-off approach, the floodgates opened. The regulations suddenly became, do people buy it? Is it an actual game and not just trash? And does it have good reviews? If it fits those three categories, then it's good to go. And since that moment and the following pandemic that forced a lot of people to stay inside, it seems that we've had more and more adult games appearing on Steam. Not just Steam, actually, straight up the front page. And the more that people played, the more the algorithms pushed. And while the games may have not stayed on the front page for more than a day, other indie devs saw this and said, "We could probably do something similar and make some money." The audience will always be there, and trust me when I say I know plenty of artists whose most popular content is a little more erotic. Hell, YouTube thumbnails with boobs get more clicks than those without. That's probably why, if you got this far, your lecherous eyes saw this video to begin with. But much like a good video game, I hope you're staying through this video because it's a good video and it's interesting and giving you something more than just an interesting thumbnail. So once you just really understand how people work, it all becomes pretty simple to wrap your mind around. Look at Overwatch. Overwatch is a game where you run around and you shoot people, it's team-based, whatever. But what Blizzard did was create characters that someone could fall in love with. They made a character for everybody. And what is, for the vast majority of humans living on the planet, the outcome of intense love? Sex. And so, of course, for many years running, Overwatch porn has been dominant on adult websites. Baldur's Gate 3, what myself and many others consider the best game of 2023, is about saving a town from certain doom with D&D rules. However, at its core is relationships with your character, the other characters, the various NPCs you meet, and in those you can spark romantic ones. And again, the outcome of those romantic relationships is often sex. It doesn't make it dirty or wrong, it makes it natural. We no longer live in a society, especially here in the West, where where you have to move the beds apart if you show a couple sleeping together on TV. It's not arbitrary rules for the sake of censorship. We as a society are ready, willing, and honestly asking for it. It's a tale as old as time. Sex sells.